Australians can't seem to catch a break. As we're finally opening up after what can only be described as a grueling lockdown, Aussies are looking down the maw of yet another crisis: high inflation. At the moment, the Reserve Bank is holding fire on raising interest rates to address the 3% inflation rate. They hope wages will catch up before they have to hit people with tightening of economic policy. I also assume the RBA is loath to increase the interest rate on a historically high government debt. But the inflation rate only tells part of the story. It doesn't account for increasing housing prices. For most people, a home is the largest purchase they will make in their lifetime, and housing is the biggest expense on most people's budgets. High housing prices, arguably, have a greater impact than any other expense currently counted in the inflation rate measurement. For many, the goal of home ownership gets further and further out of reach with each passing day. Last year, the median home price increased by 18.4%, or $103,000. For context, if you're saving for a 20% deposit, you would have to have saved this last year an extra $20,000 just to keep up. Inflation is like a sales tax no one agreed to. We're now paying the price for the $291 billion the government spent in economic stimulus during the lockdowns. Unfortunately, we cannot just print money and fix the crisis. And we need to act sooner than later to stop inflation from getting out of hand. Election campaigns promising large government expenditures are not going to help the problem. While inflation may seem like an abstract concept right now, and the last thing anyone wants to worry about after COVID, Australians are going to suffer when their savings start to dwindle and their paychecks fail to stretch as far as they used to. So Caleb, are you worried about inflation in the next coming years?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you've only got to look at the US right now, where inflation seems to be going through the roof, to see where things can go. And we often follow the trends of the US and the UK, and there's a lot of things going on overseas we should be worried about at the moment. Food and resource shortages among them. And it's interesting you make the point about housing affordability as well. And I think about this issue as a Conservative as one of the biggest issues that we face as a country, and one of the biggest threats to the idea of the normal family unit and the benefits that home ownership brings, because there is no opportunity for young people in large parts of this country to get into the housing market anymore. You know, I was lucky enough to grow up in Adelaide, where for $300,000 I was able to buy myself a two-bedroom unit reasonably close to the city. I squirreled away my money and did that. For $300,000 in Melbourne or Sydney, you'd barely be able to buy a butler's pantry or a car park, for that matter. I mean, the housing affordability in the larger cities in this country are obscene. And there are lots of people walking around who will never have that opportunity. And I think that drags them down. And you put inflation on top of that, what hope have you got?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As someone who's personally trying to save for a house, it just feels like it's further and further out of reach. How do you keep up with a $1 million median house price here in Sydney? So, Michael, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's a complicated matter, but I think one of the reasons, my understanding is, that the Reserve Bank are going to try all they can not to raise interest rates is exactly the housing market. They're looking at the debt that most people in the two big cities, Sydney and Melbourne, have got themselves into. And a lot of people, let's be honest, have lied to the bank about their financial situation, how much they spend, desperate to get into the property market. They've borrowed $1.5 million, $2 million on pretty average incomes. They've done it somehow. Any upward tick in interest rates will probably send them broke. And if there's a run of cases like this, well, then the banks, which internationally very heavily skewed to home loans in this country, are in a bit of strife. So we'd probably have to bail them out. Good luck. So there's that issue. But then, to go back to where we started, I mean, for those that argue we should have, lots of immigrants again, one of the driving factors behind, leaving aside this year, one of the driving factors behind our property prices in Sydney and Melbourne have been the fact we've been flooding the joint with people. So you can't, on the one hand, be worried about inflation, but then on the other hand say we should have lots of immigrants, because the two can go hand in glove, particularly when it's married over the issue of property.
I mean, I think I can push back a little bit on that, where I do think we can actually use immigrants to increase our housing supply and help expand our cities, expand smaller cities like Newcastle, Maitland here in New South Wales, and actually bring in more housing. I think we need to do that.
But we've tried, and they don't go there. That's the problem.
I'm hopeful that they will. Nick, do you have anything to add on this?
Oh, look, I think it was a great editorial by you, Emily. I think 2022 is going to be the year of inflation in Australia. You just look what's happening in the US at the moment, inflation over 6%. Of course, wages are rising more rapidly in the US than any time in living memory either, which is that reminder of once the inflation genie is out of the bottle and wages start rising to then meet it, it's very, very hard for policymakers to bring it back into line. Interest rates are going to go up in Australia. Everybody knows that except for the Reserve Bank of Australia. Of course, Australian banks borrow a lot of money wholesale for debt markets in the US and then on-lend it to Australians. Those interest rates are going up in the US, so that is going to hit Australia sooner rather than later. So for many young Australians, they've never experienced inflation before. I think 2022 is going to be the year when they get a taste of it.